The security camera alert pinged at 6:47 p.m. on a perfect Saturday evening in July. David Martinez, 42, a civil engineer and decorated Marine Corps veteran, was setting up folding tables in his backyard when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw his next-door neighbor, Patricia Whitmore, standing at his fence line with her phone raised, already recording. 3 months. 3 months of complaints, threats, and harassment every single time David tried to enjoy his own property. 3 months of her calling code enforcement, the HOA, even the police over backyard gatherings that fell well within every legal limit. But tonight was different. Tonight, David had 40 guests arriving in 90 minutes for his daughter's 8th birthday party. And what Patricia didn't know was that the exhausted veteran she'd been tormenting had spent the last 6 weeks consulting with attorneys, studying municipal codes, and documenting every single one of her violations. Tonight wasn't just another barbecue. Tonight was the night David stopped playing defense. Before we dive into how David turned the tables on the neighbor from hell, if you love stories where entitled people finally meet their match and justice gets served with a side of perfectly grilled burgers, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The harassment that pushed a good man past his breaking point, the confrontation where a bully learned she'd picked the wrong target, and the resolution where strategic planning met satisfying justice. The first part takes us through months of psychological warfare waged by a neighbor who believed property ownership meant controlling everyone around her. The toll it took on David's family, the peaceful attempts to coexist that were met with escalating hostility, and the moment when a father protecting his daughter's happiness decided enough was finally enough. The second part reveals the confrontation that changed everything, when Patricia overplayed her hand one final time and discovered that the quiet veteran next door had been 3 moves ahead the entire time. Armed with evidence, legal backing, and the patience of someone trained to win wars. The third part delivers the resolution that proves sometimes justice doesn't come from backing down. It comes from standing your ground so thoroughly that the bully has nowhere left to retreat. Here's exactly how it happened. David Martinez had purchased 2247 Oakwood Drive 14 months earlier, specifically choosing the corner lot for its generous yard and minimal shared property lines. After 12 years in the Marines, including 2 deployments as a combat engineer, followed by 15 years designing infrastructure projects, David valued peace, order, and the kind of quiet life where his biggest stress was perfecting his brisket rub. He and his wife Elena, a trauma nurse at County General, had saved for years to buy this 4-bedroom colonial in Riverside Heights, a middle-class suburb where families actually knew their neighbors. Their daughter Sophia was 7 years old, obsessed with soccer and dinosaurs, and David had promised her the birthday party of her dreams in their new backyard. He was the kind of father who showed up to every game, the kind of neighbor who helped elderly Mrs. Chen carry groceries, the kind of man who believed that treating people with respect was non-negotiable. He'd built a pergola with his own hands, installed landscape lighting that stayed tastefully dim, and even soundproofed his garage workshop so evening projects wouldn't disturb anyone. Everything about David's approach to home ownership was considerate and deliberate. The first incident happened on a Saturday afternoon in April, barely 2 months after they'd moved in. David was hosting a small gathering, Elena's book club, maybe 10 women total, sitting on the patio drinking wine and laughing at a volume barely audible from the street. Around 4:30 p.m., a police cruiser rolled up. Officer Hendricks emerged looking apologetic even before David reached the driveway. A neighbor had complained about excessive noise and possible code violations. David invited the officer into the backyard where Hendricks found a group of middle-aged women discussing a mystery novel, music playing at conversational level, and absolutely nothing remotely resembling a violation. The officer radioed dispatch that the call was unfounded, then quietly mentioned that this particular neighbor made frequent complaints about multiple properties. David thanked him and went back inside, assuming it was a misunderstanding. Patricia Whitmore never introduced herself, never explained her concern. She just watched from her window as the police car pulled away, and David could swear he saw her scowl. The second incident escalated 2 weeks later when David fired up his grill for a Sunday dinner with Elena's parents. Just immediate family, 4 adults total, sitting at the patio table at 6 p.m. 45 minutes into dinner, a code enforcement officer named Douglas appeared, clipboard in hand, apologizing for the interruption. Another complaint, this time about an illegal fire pit, unpermitted structures, and commercial food service. Douglas walked the property, found absolutely nothing in violation, and grew increasingly frustrated. The pergola had proper permits. The grill was a standard residential model. There was no fire pit. When David asked who filed the complaint, Douglas glanced next door at 2245 Oakwood Drive and said nothing, but his expression said everything. That evening, David walked to Patricia's front door and knocked. She answered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A woman in her mid-50s with perfectly maintained landscaping and the posture of someone who enjoyed authority. David introduced himself politely, explained the false reports were causing problems, and asked if they could discuss any concerns she had directly. Patricia's smile vanished. She informed him that his gatherings were disturbing the peace, that his lighting was too bright, that his guests parked too close to her mailbox, and that if he couldn't respect the neighborhood standards, perhaps he shouldn't have moved here. Before David could respond, she closed the door in his face. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening in June, when David was simply sitting on his porch reading a book. No guests, no music, no grill, just existing on his own property. Sophia was inside doing homework. Elena was working a night shift. A police car arrived, the third time in 8 weeks, this time with Officer Hendricks accompanied by Sergeant Ramirez. The complaint alleged drug activity and suspicious persons. David, wearing Marine Corps PT gear and reading a Tom Clancy novel, stood up slowly as both officers approached, looking deeply embarrassed. Sergeant Ramirez cut to the point immediately. "Mr. Martinez, we know these calls are nonsense. We've documented 3 unfounded complaints from the same address, but we're legally required to respond." David felt something shift inside him that moment, a cold clarity settling over him like it had during tactical operations. This wasn't about neighborhood peace anymore. This was harassment with a purpose. Patricia Whitmore wanted him to feel unwelcome enough to leave. She wanted to control who lived next door, and she was using municipal resources as weapons. David thanked both officers, went inside, and opened his laptop. If Patricia wanted to weaponize the system, David would show her what happened when you challenged someone trained to dismantle enemy fortifications. The next morning, David called Jackson and Associates, the law firm that handled his home purchase. Attorney Michelle Jackson listened to his timeline and laughed, not with humor but recognition. She'd handled 3 cases against Patricia Whitmore, all settled quietly after Patricia's pattern of harassment became documentable. Michelle explained that Patricia did this to new neighbors routinely, file complaints until they either conformed to her preferences or moved. Most people couldn't afford to fight back. But David had something most victims didn't: meticulous records, security camera footage, and the discipline to play the long game. Michelle outlined a strategy. Document everything. Let Patricia keep complaining. Build an ironclad case of targeted harassment. Then, when the moment was right, file a restraining order and civil suit simultaneously. Over the next 6 weeks, David installed additional cameras, logged every incident, requested copies of all police reports and code enforcement visits, and quietly spoke with other neighbors. Turns out Patricia had driven out 2 previous owners of David's house and attempted the same with 4 other properties. Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow David helped with groceries, had nearly lost her home to stress-induced health problems after Patricia's campaign against her backyard koi pond. But everyone had been too intimidated or exhausted to fight. David spent evenings in his garage workshop, but he wasn't building anything anymore. He was reviewing municipal codes, HOA bylaws that didn't actually apply to his property since it was technically outside the association boundaries, and noise ordinances. And he was planning Sophia's birthday party for July 20th, a party that would be so perfectly legal, so thoroughly documented, and so impossible to challenge that when Patricia inevitably complained, it would be the final piece of evidence Michelle needed. The invitation went out 3 weeks in advance. Sophia wanted a dinosaur theme with a bouncer, face painting, and her entire soccer team. David rented a commercial-grade grill that required a temporary permit, which he obtained with meticulous documentation. He hired a licensed and insured bouncer company. He notified all adjacent neighbors except Patricia in writing, providing his cell number for any concerns. He verified the event fell within permitted hours, 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. on a Saturday, with music capped at 65 decibels measured from the property line, 10 decibels below the legal limit. He even hired an off-duty police officer for traffic control, which the department enthusiastically approved after their dispatcher recognized David's address. Michelle Jackson reviewed every detail and gave her blessing. Everything was legal. Everything was documented, and everything was designed to give Patricia exactly one choice: leave him alone or hand him the final evidence he needed to end this permanently. Saturday arrived with cloudless skies and temperatures perfect for a backyard celebration. David had been setting up since noon, tables arranged precisely, bouncer inflating according to schedule, catering from Rosa's Taqueria arriving at 4:30 p.m. with full licensing displayed. At 6:47 p.m., with 30 guests already present and Sophia's face painted like a triceratops, David's phone buzzed with the security camera alert. Patricia stood at the fence line, phone raised, recording. David excused himself from conversation with another parent and walked directly toward her, Elena beside him with their own phone already recording. Patricia didn't notice them approaching until David spoke, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd commanded combat engineers under fire. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to stop recording my guests and leave my property line immediately." Patricia spun around, momentarily startled. Then her face arranged itself into manufactured outrage. "I'm documenting your illegal activities. This noise is unacceptable, and I've already called the police." David smiled, the same expression he'd worn when defusing situations in Fallujah, and pulled out his own phone. "I know you have, Patricia. Officer Mendoza is actually here already. He's been monitoring the event for the last hour as hired security. Would you like to speak with him?" David gestured toward the driveway where Officer Mendoza stood in plain clothes near the bouncer, his presence exactly the kind of detail Patricia never anticipated. Her expression flickered between confusion and anger. She recovered quickly, chin lifting. "I don't care who you hired. This is harassment. I have rights." David's smile never wavered. "You certainly do. Just like I have the right to know that your full name is Patricia Ann Whitmore, age 54, residing at 2245 Oakwood Drive, property manager for Whitmore Residential Holdings. I know you own 4 rental properties in Riverside Heights and serve on 2 HOA boards, neither of which have jurisdiction over my property. I know your management company was cited twice last year for tenant harassment. I know you filed 14 separate complaints against me in 93 days, an average of 1 every 6.6 days, all documented as unfounded. And I know you've done this to 6 other neighbors over the past 4 years. Patricia's face went pale, then flushed deep red. You've been investigating me? That's stalking. I'll file a restraining order. Elena stepped forward then, her voice carrying the exhausted patience of someone who spent 12-hour shifts holding trauma victims' hands. No, Patricia. Public records aren't stalking, but filing 14 false police reports is criminal. Targeting one family for harassment is grounds for civil action. And doing it while my daughter is trying to celebrate her birthday is the last mistake you'll make at our expense. Patricia looked between them, seeming to realize for the first time that she wasn't dealing with intimidated new homeowners anymore. She was facing a combat engineer trained in strategic planning and a trauma nurse who'd stared down actual emergencies. David pulled out a manila folder. He'd been carrying it all evening, waiting. This contains documentation of every false complaint, every unfounded code enforcement visit, every police call that wasted city resources. Attorney Michelle Jackson of Jackson & Associates has reviewed everything. You have 2 options right now, and I need your decision immediately. David opened the folder, showing Patricia copies of police reports with her name redacted in the official documents, but highlighted in his personal copies. Option 1. You continue down this path. Monday morning, we file a civil harassment suit with the documentation you see here, plus testimony from 3 other neighbors you've targeted. We simultaneously file for a restraining order that prevents you from being within 500 feet of my property line, which will make living next door rather complicated for you. We also submit a formal complaint to the city about misuse of emergency services, which carries potential criminal penalties. And we send courtesy copies of all documentation to your property management clients and both HOAs you serve on, letting them decide if they want someone with your pattern of harassment representing them. Patricia tried to interrupt, but David continued, his voice never rising, every word precisely calibrated. Option 2. You leave my family alone, completely, permanently. No more complaints unless there's an actual legitimate violation that any reasonable person would report. No more recording us. No more harassment. You go back to your house right now. You stay there. And you never interfere with our peaceful enjoyment of our property again. Because, Patricia, I need you to understand something very clearly. David stepped closer to the fence, holding her gaze with the intensity of someone who'd commanded soldiers in combat zones. I'm not the previous neighbors who gave up and moved. I'm not Mrs. Chen who was too scared to fight back. I'm a decorated Marine Corps combat engineer who learned patience during 2 deployments, and I'm married to a trauma nurse who's seen actual emergencies. This birthday party you're trying to disrupt? It's permitted, legal, properly insured, and monitored by law enforcement. You have 0 legitimate grounds for complaint, but your pattern of harassment has given me extensive grounds to act. So you can walk away right now and this ends, or you can keep pushing, and I will methodically dismantle your ability to hurt anyone in this neighborhood ever again. Your choice. You have 30 seconds. Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound. Her phone, still recording, trembled in her hand. Around them, the party continued. Children laughing in the bouncer, parents chatting at picnic tables, the smell of carne asada drifting from Rosa's catering setup. Normal, peaceful, legal. Exactly what Patricia couldn't tolerate from neighbors she couldn't control. After what felt like minutes but was probably 15 seconds, Patricia lowered her phone. This isn't over, she said, but her voice had lost its authority. David's expression remained unchanged. Yes, Patricia, it actually is. Because if you take one more action against my family, I will rain down legal consequences that will follow you for years. I have the documentation. I have the witnesses. I have the resources. And most importantly, I have the patience to see this through completely. The question is whether you have the wisdom to stop. Patricia turned and walked toward her house without another word, her shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. David watched her go, then looked at Elena, who squeezed his hand. Officer Mendoza appeared beside them, having observed the entire exchange. "Mr. Martinez, just so you know, that was handled perfectly. And if she files another false report about you, our department will be pursuing charges for abuse of emergency services." David thanked him, pocketed the manila folder, and turned back to the party where Sophia was calling for him to watch her jump in the bouncer. He walked back to his daughter's celebration, the weight that had pressed on his shoulders for 3 months finally beginning to lift. The party continued without further incident. 43 guests enjoyed food, music, and celebration until 8:47 p.m. when the last family departed, 13 minutes before the permitted end time. David had the entire event documented, decibel readings from 3 separate meters, video footage showing compliance with all permits, witness statements from attending parents, including 2 attorneys and a city council member who'd brought their kids. Officer Mendoza's security report noted 0 issues, 0 complaints from any other neighbors, and exemplary organization. On Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m., Michelle Jackson filed paperwork with Superior Court. Not a lawsuit yet, but a detailed notification of intent to sue if harassment continued, accompanied by 47 pages of documented evidence. She simultaneously filed for a civil harassment restraining order with a hearing scheduled for 3 weeks out, and she sent courtesy copies to the Riverside Heights HOA Board, the Meadowbrook Community Association where Patricia served as treasurer, and all 4 of Whitmore Residential Holdings' current tenants. By Tuesday afternoon, Patricia had resigned from both HOA positions. By Wednesday, 2 of her rental tenants had contacted Michelle about their own experiences with Patricia's harassment. The restraining order hearing happened on August 8th in a courtroom where Judge Sandra Morrison presided with a reputation for 0 tolerance toward harassment. Patricia appeared with an attorney who looked like he'd already advised her this was unwinnable. Michelle presented the documentation in systematic detail: 14 false complaints, 3 false police reports for drug activity, 2 false code enforcement claims, a pattern spanning 4 years and 7 victims. She presented Mrs. Chen, who testified about panic attacks and blood pressure spikes caused by Patricia's campaign against her koi pond. She presented the previous owner of David's house, who'd sold at a loss specifically to escape Patricia's harassment. Judge Morrison listened to 15 minutes of testimony before cutting off Patricia's attorney mid-objection. "Counselor, I've seen enough. This is one of the clearest cases of targeted harassment I've encountered. Your client has weaponized municipal services and made multiple neighbors' lives miserable for years. The judge granted a 5-year restraining order prohibiting Patricia from contacting the Martinez family or filing any complaints about their property without documented evidence of genuine violations. Additionally, Judge Morrison ordered Patricia to reimburse the city $4,200 for wasted code enforcement and police resources and imposed 100 hours of community service. As they left the courthouse, Patricia's attorney muttered something about appeals. Michelle Jackson smiled and suggested he advise his client that appealing would trigger the full civil lawsuit David had been holding in reserve. Patricia never appealed. The restraining order and judgment apparently convinced her that continuing the fight would only cost more money, time, and reputation. 2 months later, she listed 2245 Oakwood Drive for sale. The disclosure statement had to mention the restraining order, which complicated the sale, but eventually a young couple from Seattle purchased it. When they moved in, David walked over with a welcome basket and introduced himself properly, something Patricia had never done. The new neighbors, Jason and Melanie Park, were delighted to meet someone friendly. David mentioned there might be some history with the previous owner and offered to discuss it if they ever had questions. They never needed to ask because Patricia was gone. Her pattern of neighborhood terrorism ended not with violence or escalation, but with documentation, legal strategy, and the simple refusal of one veteran to be driven from his home. September arrived with cooler evenings and the kind of peace David had imagined when they first bought the house. He stood on his back porch on a Saturday evening, Sophia and Elena beside him, watching the sun set behind the oak tree he'd planted in June. The yard had fully recovered from party prep, grass lush, garden thriving, pergola lights glowing warm. Mrs. Chen had brought over homemade dumplings earlier, tearfully thanking David for standing up when she couldn't. The Riverside Heights Neighborhood Watch had invited him to join their board, specifically because of how he'd handled the Patricia situation. Other neighbors stopped by regularly now, no longer afraid that showing friendship would make them Patricia's next target. David grilled burgers most Saturdays, and the gatherings were always properly permitted, always considerate, and always peaceful. He'd learned something important during those 3 months of harassment, something his military training had taught him, but civilian life sometimes made him forget. Sometimes justice doesn't come from backing down to keep the peace. Sometimes it comes from standing your ground so completely, so legally, so thoroughly documented that the bully has nowhere left to hide. As he flipped burgers on the grill he'd once been falsely reported for, David smiled. Because justice, whether served hot off the grill or cold through legal documentation, was equally satisfying. And the smell of carne asada on a peaceful Saturday evening was the sweetest vindication he could imagine. Across the country in Portland, Oregon, retired civil rights attorney Margaret Walsh was tending her front garden when her HOA president demanded she remove the rainbow flag from her porch, citing non-existent neutrality policies. Margaret set down her trowel, stood up slowly, and fixed him with the same expression that had once cross-examined hostile witnesses in federal court. "Please," she said quietly, pulling out a binder she kept near the door specifically for moments like this. "Tell me more about these policies." "I'd love to know who thinks they can selectively enforce covenant. Restrictions that violate Oregon's housing. Discrimination laws." The president's face went pale as Margaret flipped to a page showing the exact statute and recent case precedent. "But that's a story for another time."